that person would have to then ask to go to that location and get permission. They could be denied permission, right? It's kind of like how classrooms work. You know, sometimes you don't always get to go to the bathroom whenever you want, right? But worse yet, imagine if you wanted to go to your cousin's house and your cousin lives far away because they're part of a different tribe. You know, and the Indian agent says, no, you have no business going there. We're not going to grant you a permit, right? Or, you know, for economic reasons, maybe they're not going to let you go somewhere to sell your cattle, your grain, your livestock, whatever you're producing. Additionally, you know, they might have had to pay to get these permits, so that further complicates things for people who are trying to make a living. 1884, the act made attendance at residential schools mandatory for status Indians until they were 16. Children were forcibly taken and separated from their families and were not allowed to speak their languages or practice their customs. The sale of alcohol to indigenous peoples was prohibited. So this is kind of complicated, but I know I have a news article somewhere, just a historical document, but talks about this last point where it's kind of the opposite, where the Canadian government acknowledges, particularly for the Blackfoot people, that alcohol was destroying their tribe, and it was leading to a lot of violence and conflict between different tribes. And the RCMP discovered that, where's this alcohol coming from? Oh, it's like American people coming north selling to indigenous groups. And so the RCMP actually did a lot for I think it was the Blackfoot, it could have been the Mohawk people, but one of those groups to protect them. The other point there, though, you know, I don't know what the initial goal for residential schools was, the initial good faith agreement they might have had, but obviously looking at history, we know that residential schools for many people did not go very well. It was not a good place to be, and for many indigenous peoples, you know, they had no choice. I'm trying to remember this movie's name. Maybe you kids have seen it. It's a story about indigenous peoples, and particularly like this kid's kept in a closet.
Harry Potter?
No. Story about indigenous people, if you were listening. It's like half documentary, half movie.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is it the one about the...
Like the kid kind of sneaks into a place where he's not supposed to be, and then one of the adults there like kidnaps him and puts him in like a closet or like a...
So, I forget the name of it. I think,
Was it We Were Children?
I don't know, but he went into the kitchen, I believe, or something, and he got like locked in the closet in the basement, and the nun, I think, like beat him up or something.
So this one, I thought the kid he was kind of snooping around somewhere where he maybe wasn't allowed to, and then someone discovered him and they locked him in a closet. Just the point I'm making with this is that in that film / documentary, at some point they show adults discussing, you know, the experience, and some adults had no idea that any of this abuse was going on, and so they had a very different experience. But some people were very aware, and there's this big conflict even within indigenous groups, let's say, perhaps, of, well, what was going on, right? Have you kids seen the movie Indian Horse? Right? So even there, the parents had a different experience than the children, and particularly, I think, what's his name? His name is Paul, main character. His name is Paul, I think. You know, obviously for him, it was pretty terrible because he was being sexually abused, but many of the people in those stories didn't want to talk about what was going on in the schools, right? But you know, those schools ran from the 1880s to 1996, and so that's a long period of time. There's a lot of different people going through those schools. For some years, many of those children were forced to be there, and you know, that creates problems and complications, and you know, again, that has to do with the relationship between the Canadian government and indigenous peoples. In 1885, indigenous spiritual ceremonies such as a potluck and Sundance were banned. A pass system was created to restrict indigenous people from leaving the reserve without permission. We already mentioned that. So, the potluck I learned recently is quite interesting. Do we know what a potluck is? Anyone ever done one?
Yeah.
Right, so what happens at a potluck?
Everyone brings food.
Everyone brings food, right? Anything else?
Just eat.
Right? So for us, mostly it's a food thing, right? What I learned about the potluck is that the indigenous groups, particularly in the West Coast that practice this, it was a method for them to share wealth, right? So indigenous peoples also found this problem that wealth tends to accumulate into the hands of a few people. Like there's a small group of people that are very wealthy for whatever reasons, right? Maybe they're really good at hunting, maybe they're just well liked, whatever, they're just good at leadership. And so the potluck ceremony was a way to distribute wealth, which kind of helps you understand why the government might have wanted to ban it, right? If you just understand potlucks as like a food thing, you just go there, everybody brings a meal, we all eat, it doesn't make sense.
Like to make friends, especially when it's with people you don't know.
Yeah, right. So potlucks were social ceremonies. They were spiritual. They also used them for marriages as well. But it was a very integral part of their society to make sure that one person doesn't have 80% of all the resources, right? Like for that person to be able to distribute it amongst different groups. Sometimes I learned that sometimes they destroy things just to show just how wealthy they were. It's like, I don't need this. But when you understand that, it makes sense why the government would have wanted to ban that, because not having that potluck then makes the society a bit weaker, right? Also, from my understanding, the sharing of the wealth, so whether it was sharing food, giving furs, giving valuable things that people wanted and sharing that amongst the community, it was essentially done voluntarily, right? So they're just kind of giving it away. In 1914, the government required indigenous people to ask for official permission to wear any traditional clothing at public events. Traditional dancing was outlawed off reserve. In 1925, it was outlawed entirely, right? So there is this kind of targeted attack on their culture, on their language, and perhaps on their life to some extent. Which is sadly really unfortunate. It's unfortunate that that's our government's history. I will always kind of contrast that with around this same time period in the 1800s, 1900s, a lot of different cultures were being wiped out. I would confidently say that many indigenous groups had, what you might be able to call a warrior culture, right? So again, they're not stable, they're nomadic. They move around, they conquer other people. It's not really a history we teach in our textbooks in Canada, but it's very complicated to have two very different types of societies functioning together, right? So let's say you have one group of people that they think rather than growing your food, it's better to go over there, kill those people, take all their stuff, abduct all their women, potentially enslave people, sell them. And it's better to do that than it is to stay in one spot and grow and accumulate your wealth. There are many societies like that around the world throughout history. And if you have that group of people living with a group of people that think that, hey, you shouldn't steal people's things, you should work hard for your earnings, let's say, it's very hard for those two groups of people to get along, right? Because one group is always going to prey on the other. And so many of these cultures are getting wiped out, unfortunately. But yeah, I'll always contrast with, in Canada, sure, we ban these things and it's terrible, but in many other instances, particularly, let's say in America, in South America, it was just full out violence and conflict until one group had defeated the other. And both are terrible, but I think one is more terrible than the other. So in 1918, the Canadian government is now just giving out land. 1927, Indigenous people were banned from hiring lawyers or legal representation regarding land claims. against the federal government without the government's approval, right? So this is like a conflict of interest. So indigenous people weren't even allowed to raise the concern that, hey, you took some of our land, we want this back, or you didn't sign a treaty. This issue is particularly true for BC. In that region, the government did not sign treaties, and they just kind of pushed the railroad out all the way to the west, took their land, and for many indigenous groups, they weren't allowed to actually go to court against the government to say that, hey, you didn't sign a treaty with us, this is our land, we have rights here. And kind of the irony that the government's gonna give you approval on whether or not you can actually take the government to court. So do you think they're gonna get that approval? Probably not. In 1951, the bans on dancing, ceremonies, and legal claims were removed from the Indian Act. Women were allowed to vote in band council elections. The double mother rule came into effect to remove the status of anyone whose mother and grandmother were given status through marriage. This happened when people turned 21. So again, just shifting the goalpost on who is and isn't indigenous or Indian status. In 1960, indigenous peoples were finally allowed to vote in federal elections. That may have come with the loss of their status. I'm not entirely sure. Part of this might be hard to understand and put into context, particularly if you don't know a lot of history about indigenous peoples, but it's important to